He was born drooling. His jaw gaped open, even in sleep. One eye wandered, the other stared into nothing. He never spoke a word. When startled, he screamed like a broken bell. A prince by birth, but shaped like a marionette carved wrong. The court called it illness. The doctors said degeneration. But history simply erased him. He came into the world on a June morning in 1747, in the Portici Palace overlooking the restless sea of Naples. The sun shone across the bay as if blessing the birth of a future king. Trumpets played, bells rang. The firstborn son of Charles, King of Naples and Sicily, had arrived, and with him, the promise of Bourbon continuity. But within hours, the whispers began. They said the boy's jaw wouldn't close. They said his mouth hung open, slack and dripping. They said even in sleep, his lips never met. At first, the nurses covered it with cloth. The royal physicians dismissed it as a softness of bone that would correct itself in time. But as the days became weeks and the weeks became months, the signs hardened, not just in the flesh of the child, but in the silence of those who examined him. His name was Felipe Antonio Genaro Pascual Francisco de Paula, an heir crafted from centuries of crowned blood. His father, Charles III, was a grandson of both Louis XIV and Leopold I. His mother, Maria Amalia of Saxony, descended from 2 generations of Habsburg queens. On parchment, the marriage was a triumph of diplomacy. On flesh, it was a slow unraveling. The Habsburg jaw, that cursed protruding deformity so often immortalized in portraits, now bloomed again, not through dominance but through fusion. The Bourbon droop of the lips, the soft palate weakness, the narrow skull, all of it condensed into the boy. His face did not look like one family or the other. It looked like a collision. His skull was rounded yet uneven. One cheekbone rose higher than the other. His left eye drifted slightly, unable to fixate, while the right blinked erratically at sunlight. His pupils didn't contract the same way. His eyebrows were smooth and still. When spoken to, he did not flinch, nor respond, nor cry. He drooled constantly. A silk cloth was kept at hand by every nurse who approached him. His mouth, always ajar, let saliva spill onto his bib, his cot, his toys, his sleeve. By the age of 2, it became routine, wiping, changing, hiding the stains from guests. But the stains multiplied faster than they could be denied, and he did not speak. Not as a toddler, not as a boy. There were no words, no names repeated, no whispered calls for mother or father. What came instead were sounds. Grunts, whines, bursts of laughter with no cause, shrill cries that echoed off marble corridors and sent servants rushing in, only to find the prince beating his fists against the silk curtains. The court said he was slow. The doctors said he needed more time. But the queen's face turned pale each time she held him. By age 5, the tutors were brought in. Not simple maids with lullabies, but monks and scholars trained in classical instruction. They tried Latin and prayers and the alphabet on carved wooden blocks. They tried rhythm games, bells, candles, spinning wheels, music boxes, even caged birds. Nothing worked. The boy would stare past the teacher, past the candle flame, past the world. Sometimes, he screamed. Not a tantrum, not a child's protest, but a sudden, full-throated wail that shattered the calm of the nursery and made the floorboards vibrate. Then silence again, as if his body had remembered something awful and expelled it in one long, untranslatable note. And always, the jaw, always open, always slack. Even when he slept, the nurses noted, his lips formed a pale, sagging line, as though the muscles had long since given up the effort of dignity. In the royal journal, the entry for Felipe's 6th birthday was only 3 words long. Still cannot speak. Yet none dared question his birthright. He was still the firstborn. Still a prince of Naples and Sicily. Still the first heir of Charles. The court celebrated his birthdays with quiet cake and tighter smiles. Dignitaries sent letters of congratulations, unaware that their words were received by a boy who could not read, nor understand, nor return the gesture with anything more than a vacant stare. The palace spun stories. Some claimed he was merely shy. Others said he had a condition common among sensitive children. Still others, more cruelly, said he was cursed, a consequence of too much blue blood in one vein. A punishment, perhaps, for dynasties that had folded into themselves too often, like dough pressed without leaven. One physician from Naples, whose notes survive in the archive, wrote, "The child has shown no recognition of faces nor memory of names. He vocalizes in bird-like patterns and often injures himself when startled. We attempted music, but he covered his ears. His jaw remains slack, even in unconsciousness. I have not encountered a case so profound." Yet this was not the kind of diagnosis that courts welcomed. Infirmity, especially in a firstborn, could not be paraded. So they whispered, and clothed him in silk, and hoped. But silk does not cure what bone has bent, and hope does not fix what blood has weakened. They tried to hold his hand toward the throne, but even that gesture could not find grip. A boy born to rule, a body unable to respond, a name written on royal documents, beside words he would never read. A child not broken in war, nor in plague, but at the very moment of creation. A statue cracked at the kiln, yet placed at the altar anyway. And thus began the life of Prince Felipe. Not as a rising star in Europe's dynastic sky, but as a dimming flame, flickering, gasping, and slowly being moved behind the curtain. He sat on the tiled floor of the nursery, surrounded by blocks with gilded letters. He did not pick them up. He did not arrange them. He did not even look at them. A bird in a golden cage can forget it has wings. Felipe never knew he had a voice. By the time he was 3, the court had stopped waiting for first words. They had heard none. No mama, no si, no cooing repetition of syllables. His mouth remained open, as if in permanent hesitation. But hesitation requires thought, and there was no sign he grasped the world around him at all. Servants approached him with toys, rattles, carved horses. He would touch them briefly, then drop them without recognition. Sometimes he bit them. Sometimes he stared through them. One maid swore he once smiled at a painted drum, but no one ever saw him do it again. He drooled. It was constant, involuntary, and deeply undignified. His lips, incapable of closing, left a thin trail of moisture down his chin, dampening the silk of his robes and the embroidery of his pillows. The nurses wiped him dozens of times a day. During audiences, he was kept behind curtains or doors. No foreign visitor was to see him like this. The body that should have held a crown could not even hold its own tongue. The queen began to weep in private. They brought in monks who had taught generations of princes, men who could recite psalms backward and had trained orphans into diplomats. They knelt before the boy with flashcards, with bells, with carved icons of saints. They spoke softly, then firmly, then loudly. Nothing. He would sometimes glance at them. Other times he would scream, Not out of fear, not out of anger, just a shrill, spontaneous cry, like something primal leaking from a mind without guardrails. It could start in the middle of the night. It could interrupt Mass. It could pierce the air of a garden at dusk when even the birds had gone quiet. One tutor tried music. They placed a small harpsichord near the window and played scales with gentle precision. For a moment, Felipe seemed to sway. His head tilted slightly to one side. He moved his fingers on his lap. But then he began to flap his arms. Not rhythmically, not with joy, but in a disjointed, erratic motion, as if trying to fly away from something inside himself. He knocked the instrument over. The tutor never returned. By age 7, it was clear. The boy could not be taught. Not Latin, not prayer, not etiquette or geography or music theory. He did not recognize numbers. He could not trace letters. When shown a drawing of his own family, he did not point to his mother, nor his father, nor himself. He stared at the parchment until he grew bored and tore it in two. Some blamed the wet nurse. Others blamed the astrologer who predicted his birth. But most blamed the blood. Too royal, too refined, too condensed. A century of inbreeding had folded history in on itself, and this boy was the soft, voiceless echo of that collapse. His seizures began around the same time. They weren't grand. Not at first. He would suddenly fall limp, or tremble lightly, or roll his eyes back while drooling more than usual. The doctors observed. They prescribed prayers, oils, silence. When the seizures grew more violent, full-body jerks, clenched fists, foaming mouth, they tied his wrists lightly to the bedposts at night to protect him from himself. He scratched his face, he clawed his neck, he yanked at his hair until a bald patch bloomed behind his left ear. When startled, he would either laugh or scream, never both, and sometimes bang his forehead against the marble wall. The court physicians wrote, "The prince reacts not to tone, nor to light, nor to known voices. He emits sounds akin to birdsong, but never repeats them. He appears unaware of his surroundings, though he flinches when touched without warning. His coordination is limited. Walking requires assistance. He soils himself regularly." No one used the word retarded. It had not yet entered the medical vocabulary. But every description pointed to what we now know. Profound intellectual disability, paired with a complex neurological disorder, likely epilepsy, possibly schizophrenia, certainly untreatable in the 18th century. And yet he was still a prince, still addressed in formal letters as Su Alteza, still dressed in tailored silks and embroidered robes, still bowed to by footmen who knew the boy could not understand what a bow meant, still offered cakes on his birthday, which he sometimes threw at the wall. He was unpredictable, but not violent, not toward others. He simply existed on a different plane, unreachable, untouchable, undeniable. Some days he lay curled on the floor, arms around his knees, rocking gently for hours. Other days he paced the corridor of his wing in small circles, muttering nonsense and blinking at the ceiling. On rare occasions, he laughed. It was a strange, sudden sound, high-pitched, breathy, empty of context. And it ended as abruptly as it began. They brought him flowers once. He tore them apart, petal by petal. A priest tried holy water. A doctor tried laudanum. A nurse tried honey on the lips. Nothing softened the disconnect. And so, the tutors stopped coming. The monks were reassigned. The queen prayed more, but spoke less. And Felipe, the boy who could not be taught, was left with his toys, his silence, and a small army of nurses who no longer hoped for progress, only calm. Because Because calm was a gift. Because calm meant no screaming, no seizures, no broken glass. Because calm was the closest they would ever come to control. In the year 1759, death reshaped the map of Europe. Charles, then King of Naples and Sicily, received news that his half-brother, Ferdinand VI of Spain, had died without issue. The Spanish throne now awaited him. A new crown, a greater kingdom, a future recast in gold. But on that same day, in a chamber bathed in Neapolitan heat, his firstborn son sat on the floor, humming nonsense into a wall. Prince Felipe was 12 years old. His mouth still hung open. His words still had not come. His gait remained unstable, his gaze unfocused, his mind unreachable. And yet, he was the legal heir. He bore the name. He carried the blood. He had been born beneath frescoed ceilings and baptized beneath golden crosses as Principe delle Due Sicilie, destined in writing, if not in soul, to follow his father onto the thrones of Europe. But a crown cannot rest on a head that cannot hold still. And history does not wait for a child who cannot answer his name. The court convened in silence, behind tapestries, in narrow halls, in the late hours of Neapolitan night when only the cicadas listened. There was no royal proclamation, no legal decree, no signed document declaring Felipe unfit. Such language would have stained the Bourbon image, would have invited whispers, would have confirmed what many suspected but none dared record. So instead, they erased him softly. No announcement, no declaration, just absence. His name, once spoken beside the phrase "future king," began to fade from conversation. In diplomatic reports, it slipped to the second paragraph. In public celebrations, his image was quietly left out. The silver plates engraved for his investiture as heir were melted down and reshaped for his younger brother. That brother, Charles, was barely 11. He could read, he could ride, he could recite his lessons, he could look his father in the eye and not flinch. He could stand still during Mass without shrieking or biting his sleeve. And so, a decision was made. Charles would be named Prince of Asturias, heir to the Spanish throne. Felipe would remain in Naples, in his room, in silence. The Spanish succession records for 1759 list only one son, Charles. Felipe's name disappears entirely. No explanation, no footnote, not even a courteous euphemism, just a gap, as if he had never drawn breath. One diplomat from Vienna, writing to his sovereign, remarked, "It is strange. The eldest son of King Charles has not been seen in court for some time. I was told he remains in Naples for reasons of health, though no one speaks directly of him." Even the phrase "reasons of health" was generous. There were rumors, of course. Rumors that the boy howled like an animal during storms. That he struck his own head until bruises bloomed beneath his hair. That he had once lunged at a priest. That mirrors had been removed from his room after he attacked his own reflection. But none of it was confirmed, and confirmation was not the goal. The goal was distance. From Naples, from Felipe, from the reality that the Spanish crown had once, however briefly, belonged to a boy who could not wear it. In Caserta, a new wing was furnished, not regal, not gilded, functional, hushed, protected. There, Felipe remained, attended by monks who no longer taught, only watched, dressed by nurses who no longer hoped, only managed, guarded by servants who no longer bowed, only entered and exited without sound. He was a prince still, in title if not in presence. But titles grow cold when unused. And Felipe, The prince who should have stood before nations instead sat cross-legged on the stone floor, tracing circles in chalk that no one dared erase. Sometimes he drew shapes, sometimes birds. Once a jagged figure that looked like a crown. They did not ask what it meant. They stopped asking anything. The Queen, Maria Amalia, visited less, not from cruelty, but from despair. Each visit reminded her not of what could be, but of what never would. Charles III never spoke of him publicly again. In Madrid, a new court formed. New tapestries were hung, new portraits painted, and in every gallery, in every genealogical chart, in every mural of royal descent, Felipe's name was absent. The throne had no vacancy. It had simply skipped over him, as if the blood had flowed around a stone lodged in the riverbed. He did not protest. He could not protest. Whether he understood what had been taken is unknown. Whether he sensed that his brother now wore the garment sewn for him is lost to silence. But in the room where he once clutched wooden blocks and stared through music, the air grew heavier. A throne needs a name. Felipe had one, long and royal. But the court needed a name that could answer. And so the boy became a ghost, a shadow on the palace floor, a monarch in potential only, wrapped in silk restraints and watched through half-open doors. One day, a courier from Madrid brought a gift for the new heir, a golden globe etched with constellations. The package passed through Naples, where the boy who should have received it once lived. It never reached him. Instead, it traveled onward, to the child who had taken his place, to the name that could speak, to the future history had chosen. They gave him a palace, but it was never meant to be walked through. Caserta, the jewel of Bourbon architecture, stretched across the countryside like a marble mirage. Vast, symmetrical, impossibly grand. Its halls echoed with footsteps of ministers. Its fountains rose like praise into the Neapolitan sky. Yet in the eastern wing, behind a heavy door no one ever opened without lowering their voice, lived the prince no one wanted to remember. Felipe was 15. He had never addressed a court. He had never ridden a horse. He had never left the wing. His chambers were large but lifeless. Stone floors softened by thick rugs, windows shrouded with gauze to mute the light. Walls hung with tapestries not of war or myth, but of clouds and birds and trees. Soothing things, things that didn't demand logic. There were no mirrors, not since the incident. One afternoon, years earlier, Felipe had approached the full-length looking glass in his childhood room. A rare moment of clarity had passed through him. Or perhaps it was nothing more than the alignment of shadows and instinct. But he stood in front of it, slack-jawed, eyes twitching, and suddenly screamed. It wasn't a scream of recognition. It was a scream of terror. Then came the fists. He struck the mirror until it shattered, until his hands bled, until the nurses pried the shards from his palms. After that, all reflections were removed. Even polished silver was banned from his quarters. The prince, as it was decided, should never be confronted with what he was not allowed to become. His days followed a rhythm few understood. He woke with the sun, though he never rose on his own. He needed help sitting up, needed arms to guide him to the basin, needed hands to button the clothes he sometimes tore off mid-morning. Breakfast was presented on gold-edged porcelain, but he ate with his fingers, often dropping food into his lap and laughing when it stained. There were chalks, dozens of them, in colors he seemed to favor without reason. He would draw on the stone tiles until his fingers hurt, scrawling symbols no one could read, looping spirals and zigzags, and once, over the course of 3 days, a figure that might have been a bird. He did not speak. But he made sounds, clicks with his tongue, gurgles, sudden whoops of laughter, sharp gasps followed by silence, repetitive hums, especially when it rained. If music drifted from the chapel, muffled organ notes through thick walls. He would sometimes rock, gently, side to side, as if the air itself were giving him shape. The monks assigned to him no longer attempted scripture. They read aloud to themselves, prayed in corners, watched his movements with the detachment of men who had once believed in healing and now believed in patience. The younger ones called him Il Silenzioso, the silent one. Though in truth, silence was not his defining trait. It was absence. An absence so complete it swallowed recognition. Even among those who saw him daily, he became an outline, a set of behaviors, a routine. He was less a prince than a pattern. Some days he screamed, not out of rage, not even fear, just noise, a flood of it. Long, jagged howls that began in his chest and broke out through his teeth, startling birds on the windowsill and freezing every hand in mid-task. He would claw at the wall, tear his shirt, bite his wrist. The doctors called it agitation. The priests called it visitation. No one dared call it grief. They restrained him gently, with ribbons at first, then cloth, then belts. Not to punish, only to protect. There were nights his hands had to be tied to the frame of his bed, lest he reopen the scars on his scalp. Sometimes they untied him in the morning to find his nails bloodied from scratching the floor. The worst episodes came without warning. A change in the weather, the distant sound of fireworks, a knock that was too loud, a word he seemed to recognize but never repeat, and always the mouth. Gaping, moist, drooling. Even at rest, the muscles of his jaw never tightened. Even in sleep, his lips did not meet. The nurses wiped him every hour. They changed his bedding twice a day. The odor of saliva soaked into fabric so expensive it had once been woven for kings. Now it wrapped a forgotten son. He did not ask to go outside. No one told him what outside meant. Occasionally, they opened the balcony doors. He would stand, swaying slightly, gripping the frame, staring at the birds above the garden. Once, he reached toward one, fingers trembling, eyes wide, and murmured a sound that almost resembled a word. They never heard it again. No portraits were painted of him. The court artists were instructed to focus on his siblings. Charles, now heir to Spain, appeared in dozens of oil canvases, riding horses, holding scrolls, gazing nobly into the future. Felipe existed only in sketches tucked into medical reports, crude outlines of his posture, his hands, his strange gait. He did not walk steadily. His hip, malformed since birth, caused a limp so pronounced he often needed 2 aides just to move between rooms. When he refused, they let him stay curled on the floor, drawing in silence. It was easier than coaxing him into motion. Easier than pretending there was progress. Easier than facing the truth that the palace had become his prison not by bars, but by decision. A decision no one signed. A punishment no one spoke aloud. A burial above ground, in silk, in stone, in bureaucracy. And so, the Prince of Naples and Sicily lived behind doors that did not lock, but might as well have. He breathed the scent of lemon trees he never touched, heard the voices of priests he could not comprehend, wore the colors of royalty, but left no trace in the halls where names were engraved. He had a title, but no voice. He had a wing, but no freedom. He had a throne once. Now he had chalk and silence, and rooms that stretched wide enough to echo, but never wide enough to let him leave. They say the mirror cracked before he touched it. It stood in the far corner of his chamber, tall, silent, patient. A relic of royal taste, framed in gold leaf, once hung in the queen's antechamber, later moved to Caserta under no official order. No one knew why it had been placed there. No one remembered who authorized it. But for weeks, it stood facing the window, gathering sunlight, watching the boy who never watched himself. Felipe did not understand reflection. He had no reason to. The boy did not respond to faces, not even those he saw daily. Not the monks who dressed him, not the nurses who bathed him, not the aides who lifted him when he fell. His gaze wandered, his pupils drifted. His eyes rarely settled long enough to register another human's expression, much less his own. But that morning, something shifted. It was autumn. Light slanted at a softer angle, golden and thin. The palace felt quieter than usual. Felipe had been drawing chalk lines across the tiles, long, curved arcs that crossed over one another like tidal patterns. He muttered softly. Repetitive sounds, incomprehensible syllables. He didn't stop when the door opened. He didn't stop when the bells rang for midday prayer. He didn't stop until he stood. Then slowly, he walked toward the mirror. Witnesses said he was almost calm. His left foot dragged slightly, as it always did. His right shoulder dipped forward, but his steps were deliberate. Not the flailing shuffle of his usual gait, but something close to intention. As if his body, for once, obeyed a signal even his mind could not decode. He stood before the glass, tilted his head, and stared. A few seconds passed, then 5, then 10, and then he screamed. It was a scream no one in Caserta forgot. Loud, long, wrenching. A sound that began as a child's terror, but ended in something far deeper. A groan torn from the belly of something cornered, wounded, uncomprehending. He struck the glass with his palms, then with his fists, then with his forehead. The frame buckled. The mirror split. A fine vein of silver cracked from corner to corner, and then another. And then the entire sheet spider-webbed like a frozen lake breaking under sudden weight. The nurses reached him too late. Blood streamed down his fingers. His lips bled. One shard lodged itself in his thumb. He did not cry from pain. He collapsed. He was silent. After that day, the mirror was removed. Quietly, permanently. No replacement was brought in. No discussion was held. From that moment onward, Felipe would never again see his own face. Not in glass, not in paint, not in ink or chalk or canvas. Because what is the use of a reflection when the world refuses to reflect you back? Court painters, already reluctant to depict him, were given strict instructions. He was not to be sketched, not studied, not recorded. A few anatomical drawings remained in medical files, crude, clinical, faceless, but no portrait of the Prince of Naples and Sicily survives. Not one. Not even a miniature. Not even a profile. A royal without a face. In a dynasty obsessed with lineage, with legacy, with image, Felipe became the exception. While his brothers were painted astride horses, wrapped in ermine, flanked by banners, he was reduced to a handful of vague descriptions and a few mumbled recollections. Even the Queen's letters, once warm, became colder, rarer, and eventually silent. One monk wrote, "He seems unaware that he has form. He reacts to shadows but not to his outline. I do not believe he recognizes himself as being separate from the room." There is a kind of death that precedes the body's end. It comes in the form of erasure, not of breath, but of shape. And in Felipe's case, it began the day the mirror left. They took away more than just the glass. After the incident, his windows were draped permanently. The daylight was filtered, then dimmed. Paintings were removed. He no longer received new clothes, only variations of the same soft robe. Color faded from his surroundings. No blues, no reds, only muted browns, creams, grays. Even the birds that had once fluttered on the frescoes above his bed were painted over. He no longer looked up. He began spending more time curled beneath the table, tracing the underside with his fingers. He bit his sleeves. He flinched at echoes. He hummed louder than before, and more often. The patterns he drew became tighter, more obsessive. Spirals, loops, circles, endless rings around a void. Sometimes he wouldn't sleep. He would sit in the same spot from dusk until morning, rocking gently, blinking slowly, mouthing sounds into the dark. And if anyone tried to touch him during these moments, he would scream again. Not in rage, but in a kind of startled betrayal. As if their presence broke some unspoken contract between him and his own disappearance. The Queen stopped writing. Her final reference to him came in a private letter to her sister. Felipe is alive, yes, but I cannot say he is here. She never saw him again. The king, now Charles III of Spain, never mentioned him in public. At court in Madrid, his name was absent from all introductions, from all prayers, from all ceremonial listings. Even in the whispered registers of mourning, he was a blank space between siblings. No one in Spain knew what had become of him. Most believed he had died. Some, more cynically, believed that might have been kinder. But he had not died. He had simply been erased, face first. Because a prince who cannot speak may still be pitied. But a prince who cannot be seen, he becomes myth, a whisper in a hallway, a footnote in a ledger, a missing portrait on a palace wall. And so, the boy born to be seen by millions was unseen by all. Not by fate, not by war, not by accident, but by choice. There was a time when they shared a crib. Felipe, the firstborn, and Charles, the second son, only 15 months apart. Born of the same parents, nursed by the same women, rocked to sleep by the same hands beneath the same ceiling painted with cherubs and stars. For a moment, before language, before rank, before judgment, they were simply children. But that moment didn't last. By the time Charles could walk, Felipe was still crawling. By the time Charles could recite prayers, Felipe was still humming to shadows. By the time Charles wore his first miniature sword, Felipe had already been confined to a quieter wing, and Charles learned to avoid the hallway with the locked doors. They told him nothing. No tutor explained why his older brother screamed into walls or bit his own wrist. No monk described what happened in the eastern wing. No nurse ever compared the two boys aloud. But silence has its own weight, and children, even royal ones, know when something is being hidden. The first time Charles saw Felipe in years, he was 13. It was not planned. The younger prince had wandered farther than usual. A lapse in supervision, a door left unlatched, a moment in which the house of silk and stone lost its grip on the boy it had sealed away. Charles had been walking with his tutor, reviewing lessons in Latin verse. He turned a corner, and there he was. Felipe stood barefoot, mouth open, hair tangled, tunic stained, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the corridor, or nothing at all. Charles froze. Felipe blinked. Then he lunged. Not with intent, not with malice, not even with speed. Just a sudden, unbalanced reach. Arms extended, hands twitching, a garbled sound escaping his throat. Charles stumbled back. The tutor pulled him away. Guards arrived. Felipe collapsed. But Charles never forgot. In his private writings, few and cryptic, he refers to the day the ghost reached for me. Whether he meant it literally or metaphorically, no one knows. But after that, he refused to walk that corridor again. The distance between the brothers grew into silence. The silence hardened into fear. The fear fossilized into policy. As Charles grew into the air of Spain, groomed with velvet and precision, Felipe remained in Naples, surrounded not by scrolls and swords, but by straps, soft cloths, and the quiet murmurs of monks trained not to teach, but to restrain. And even from afar, the family's fear grew. It wasn't just discomfort, it was anxiety. The kind that blooms in royal circles when imperfection cannot be named, but must be managed. Rumors had begun to circulate, whispers among courtiers and foreign envoys, that there was another son, that the firstborn still lived, that he was unfit, unstable, unnatural. Some said he was possessed. Others said he was divine punishment for Bourbon arrogance. The Spanish court avoided the subject entirely. No paintings, no announcements, no celebrations, not a single word from Charles III. When visiting dignitaries inquired, they were met with stiff smiles and quick diversions. Felipe's name became a fog, present, lingering, but impossible to grasp. But inside the family, behind closed doors, the truth was spoken more cruelly. The king's advisors debated whether the boy should be moved to a cloister, to a medical facility, even to a rural estate where no one would ever find him. One priest suggested exorcism. Another suggested burial, metaphorical or otherwise. And in one preserved note, dated in the years after the Spanish succession, an advisor wrote, "Better he die in silence than rule in chaos." Whether the king read it is unknown. Whether the queen agreed is also unclear. But nothing changed. Felipe remained where he was, silent, alive, forgotten, and feared. Feared not because he was violent, though his seizures could look like rage. Not because he was malevolent, though his screams unsettled even the strongest guards. But because he was a reminder that bloodlines could betray, that kings could sire broken sons, that thrones, though gilded, rested on bones as frail as anyone else's. Charles IV, as he would later be known, grew into his role with formality and duty, but never with warmth. He was diligent, obedient, and devout, but never sentimental. He bore no public affection for his brother, no letters, no tributes, no private visits. When pressed about Felipe in old age, he reportedly replied, "That was God's will, not mine." And perhaps it was. But that divine will had consequences. It bred a monarchy that erased its own reflection, a lineage that punished its own shadows, a brotherhood severed not by distance, but by silence so complete it became institutional, enshrined not in decree, but in omission. In Caserta, Felipe continued his life behind the veil. He aged without purpose, his hair graying early, his posture slumping further, his eyes growing dimmer. He rarely stood unaided. His drawings became shakier. His hums lost their rhythm, but he still muttered, soft, broken phrases no one could decipher. Once, during a storm, a servant claimed he said a word, a real word, a name, Carlos. It was never repeated, and no one told the king, because some truths rot faster when exposed to light, because some princes are easier to manage when left in the dark, because some brothers are easier to rule when never called brothers at all. At first, it was just a missed name, a document listing royal children sent to a foreign court. Felipe's line was absent, an invitation to a religious mass, addressed only to Charles and Ferdinand. A registry of heirlooms, his silver rattle was no longer included. The omissions were small, barely noticeable, easily excused. He was in poor health, they said. He preferred solitude. He remained in Naples for medical observation. The lies were polite. Then they were deliberate. Then they were law. By 1770, Felipe no longer existed in public record. The boy who had once been the firstborn of Charles III, the crowned Prince of Naples and Sicily, the presumed heir to 2 thrones, now had no place in succession charts, no titles beside his name, and no ceremonial mention in court proceedings. His coat of arms was never finalized. His royal cipher was never engraved. He became a prince in past tense, an inheritance that had failed to arrive, a chapter unwritten in the official chronicle. In Madrid, his name passed into shadow. In Naples, it was spoken only in whispers. And in Caserta, it disappeared even from the mouths of those who fed and bathed him daily, not out of cruelty, not even indifference, but from the slow erosion of memory when faced with permanence. Felipe did not change. He still rose each morning with assistance, still traced circles with chalk, still blinked at sunbeams like a man who'd never understood the sky. But the palace around him changed. Guards were reassigned, furniture rearranged, letters redirected. He was no longer His Highness. He was the boy in the wing. He was the patient, the burden, the past. One monk kept a journal. In it, he wrote, "No visitors, no letters, no inquiry from Madrid, not even from the Queen. He is alive, yes, but no longer part of anything, no longer remembered." When Felipe turned 30, no candles were lit, no mass was held, no announcement was made. The royal court held a gala that week in Madrid to celebrate a diplomatic success. No one mentioned that the eldest son of the king had reached what, by noble standards, should have been a triumphant age. 30 meant readiness for power. Felipe still could not speak. His hands trembled. His legs had grown weaker. He required a special chair to sit upright during meals. Sometimes he refused to eat for days. Sometimes he chewed his sleeves until they tore. He no longer hummed as much. His eyes, once darting, now remained fixed on the floor. But the silence from the outside world only deepened. Foreign diplomats noticed. A letter from the Austrian envoy to the Spanish court, dated 1775, reads, "It is most peculiar. The king has 3 sons, yet only 2 are acknowledged. The eldest, I am told, is unwell, though no physician will attest to his case, and no courtier will utter his name." By this point, Felipe had been hidden for nearly 2 decades. Hidden, but not dead. Alive, but erased. He had never committed a crime, never betrayed a crown, never challenged a brother. His only fault was his body. His only scandal was his silence. And yet, the machine of monarchy, so precise, so meticulous in its ceremonies, could find no place for a prince who could not stand during Mass, or kneel before relics, or speak during a coronation. He was an error in the manuscript of dynastic perfection. And errors, when uncorrectable, are quietly removed. The corridors of Caserta echoed less now. Some rooms were left empty, some doors were sealed. Some servants rotated out and were told not to speak of what they had seen. The Queen, Maria Amalia, wrote nothing further. Her final mention of Felipe remained locked in a private letter, never acknowledged publicly, never confirmed by her husband, and never replied to. Charles IV, his brother, ascended in dignity, but never in memory. No statue of Felipe was commissioned, no medal minted, no relic preserved. Even his childhood possessions, carved toys, swaddling cloth, monogrammed combs, were boxed away and eventually discarded. The royal house of Bourbon continued without interruption. Portraits were painted, treaties signed, successions secured. And the prince who had once represented its future was folded into a room like unused linen, clean, soft, and undisturbed. It was a disappearance without violence, a deletion without ink, a death before dying. He sat for hours, tracing the same corner of the same stone tile with his thumb. He blinked without focus. He muttered sounds no longer sharp enough to be called words. He leaned toward windows he never opened. And when he laughed, if it could still be called laughter, it was more like a wheeze, a memory of a sound he had never fully known. He was a royal ghost, haunting a palace not through footsteps, but through absence. And yet his heart still beat. His lungs still rose and fell. His body, fragile but persistent, carried on, which made the silence all the more unbearable, because he had not died in battle, had not been exiled for treason, had not fled into the night with shame at his back. He had simply been born wrong, born in the wrong form, at the wrong time, into the wrong expectation. And so, they wrote him out, not with malice, but with velvet gloves, not with daggers, but with ellipses. No tombstone, no scandal, no trial, just a name that stopped appearing, and a boy who stopped being expected. It happened quietly. No trumpet, no procession, no black drapes on palace balconies, no tolling bell from the royal chapel. On the morning of September 19th, 1777, Felipe Antonio Genaro Pascual Francisco de Paula, firstborn of Charles III, once heir to 2 kingdoms, died in the east wing of the royal palace of Caserta. No cause of death was officially announced. There was no autopsy, no physician summoned from court, no official seal placed on parchment. Only a line, barely legible, in a folded medical report. The prince failed to rise. Breathing ceased before midday, signs of fever in the days prior. Those who attended him said he had been still for 3 days before the end. No seizures, no screams, no drawing, just stillness. He had refused food the week before, barely drank water. His eyes remained open for hours, but no one could tell if he saw anything at all. He sat by the window, unmoving, gazing at the pale sky like someone who had finally lost the thread of whatever held him tethered. When the monk assigned to his care found him unresponsive, he did not panic. He checked his pulse, waited a moment, folded the boy's hands. Then he rang a small bell. No alarm was sounded, no messengers dispatched, no priest rushed in to perform a final rite. Because in that corner of the palace, the one no one entered without reason, death had long been a familiar guest. A rumor waiting for confirmation, a silence deep enough to swallow its own echo. The prince who never ruled, never spoke, never stood alone, had finally done something alone. He died. And the court, the family, the country, the dynasty, did not weep. There was no royal edict announcing his passing. No funeral mass in Madrid. No days of mourning declared. No public statement from the king. No black armband worn by his brothers. The death of Prince Felipe was not an event. It was a correction. A line quietly removed from the family tree. A door shut with finality. A file closed and placed among others never meant to be read. He was buried without ceremony, in a small chapel near Caserta, beneath marble that bore no title, no epitaph, no mention of his lineage. A few monks sang hymns. A single candle flickered in a space built for dozens. His coffin was unadorned, carried not by generals or statesmen, but by 4 attendants who had washed his clothes for years. They did not speak as they lowered him. They did not pause for silence. They did not know what to say, because there were no stories, no victories, no lovers, no children, no battles, no speeches, no final words to remember. Only the sound of dirt. And then, nothing. The chapel was locked. His room, the next day, was stripped. The chalk drawings were washed away. The bedding burned. The curtains removed. The clothes folded and stored, then forgotten. No memorial was erected. No statue carved. No portrait commissioned in posthumous mercy. There would be no Felipe Gallery, no Felipe Street, no Felipe Hall of State. Only a small, dusty corner of a ledger with a date of birth and a date of death, and no details between. Even among those who had tended him, his name faded. He had never called them by theirs, had never thanked them, had never returned their gaze. He had, in their eyes, belonged more to silence than to the living, and in silence, he was buried. In Madrid, Charles IV continued his preparations for rule. The court held balls, decrees were signed, daughters were married off, sons were born. The machinery of monarchy did not slow, did not pause, did not hesitate. Because Felipe had never been part of the machinery, he had been an error in design, a quiet flaw patched over by routine, one that had now, conveniently, resolved itself. The king never spoke of him again. The queen did not travel for his burial. No letters were sent in mourning. Only one survives. Unsigned, its origin unclear, perhaps from a nun, perhaps a nurse, in which a single sentence is scribbled. He went out like a candle not meant to be lit in the first place. What is a funeral if no one grieves? What is death when it arrives for someone who is already gone? The palace halls echoed as before. The bells rang for other events. The priests lit incense for other souls. But no one knelt for Felipe, because to kneel would be to remember, and to remember would be to admit that once the firstborn of a king had lived, that once he had smiled, perhaps, that once he had drawn a bird, that once he had reached out, open-mouthed, toward the glass, that once there had been hope. But hope is dangerous in dynasties that worship order. And disorder, especially the kind that drools, that mutters, that flails, must not be mourned, only sealed, only silenced, only buried, without a crown, without a name, without a voice. And so, Felipe died, as he had lived, unclaimed. The royal gallery of Spanish kings stretches across the west wing of El Escorial, a cold procession of portraits and pedestals, each ruler cast in marble, bronze, or oil, each name etched in gold leaf beneath a crown carefully preserved. Philip V, Ferdinand VI, Charles III, Charles IV. But there is no Felipe, no bust, no canvas, no inscription, not even a plaque hidden behind a curtain or a half-effaced name on an old wall. There is a gap, not in the sequence, not in the chronology, but in the truth. Where he should have stood, there is only air. The pedestal is missing. Or perhaps it was never carved, because history does not merely forget, it edits. And Felipe, the prince born to inherit, was not just forgotten, he was removed. Removed from the line of succession, removed from ceremony, removed from portraits, from prayers, from printed genealogies. For nearly a century, official Spanish records listed Charles IV as the firstborn of Charles III. Not second, not replacement. First. As though Felipe had never drawn breath, as though his 30 years had been a clerical error. School children reciting the line of Bourbon kings would never stumble over his name because it was never printed in their books. Diplomats studying dynastic charts would never question his absence because no footnote pointed to a brother locked in Caserta. Tourists visiting palaces would never pause before a painted likeness because there was none. It was a deletion so complete, so systematic, that it became a kind of art. The art of silence. The monarchy could not afford to be associated with deformity. Not in the age of enlightenment, when reason was king and bloodline meant destiny. A disabled heir was more than a tragedy. He was an argument against divine right, so they erased the argument. And in doing so, erased the boy. Only in private did fragments remain. In a letter from Queen Maria Amalia to her sister, written years after Felipe's death, she referred to him not by name, but by pain. Mi pobre hijo perdido. My poor lost son. She wrote nothing more. No memories, no cradle songs, no birthdays. Only loss. And even that was never meant to be public. The letter was found decades later in a sealed box, tucked among other forgotten correspondences, receipts, herbal recipes, and notes of condolence unrelated to Felipe. His mention was accidental, a mother grieving in margins. In the archives of Caserta, a linen ledger remains, a list of rooms, occupants, and expenditures. Between 1760 and 1777, one chamber is marked simply as Ala Orientale, Silenzio Speciale, East Wing, Special Silence. No name, no title, just silence. That silence, institutional and absolute, outlasted everyone who knew him. The monks died, the nurses retired, the ministers who wrote him out of law faded into the dust of their own offices. And what was left? A boy with no portrait, no epitaph, no record, collapsed into myth. He became a rumor, a question whispered by historians, a gap in the timeline, a curiosity chased by archivists. Only in the 20th century did his name begin to re-emerge in obscure biographies, in critical studies of Bourbon succession, in footnotes that dared ask, who was the firstborn of Charles III? And even then, the answers came thin, fragmented, doubted. There were no first-hand accounts, no journal in his hand, no testimony of personality, only a few medical descriptions, only scraps of silence. Even today, among scholars, debate continues. Was he epileptic? Was it severe autism? Was it schizophrenia masked by ignorance of the time? Or was it all of these, multiplied by generations of consanguinity that turned royal blood into a slow-acting poison? We will never know. Because those who could have told us chose not to. And the only witness left, the boy himself, never spoke. He had no words to defend his place. No voice to argue his right, no power to preserve his face in stone. So his absence hardened into structure, and the gallery, with its perfect symmetry and polished names, carried on unblemished. A history edited for ease, a memory sterilized for legacy, a crown passed without the weight of guilt, because the one who was meant to wear it had been wrapped in quiet and buried in dust before it ever touched his brow. Even in digital records today, his name is rarely bolded. No Wikipedia page bears his full story. No museum displays his clothing. No children are named after him. No feast day marks his birth or death. Just a line, if one is lucky. Prince Felipe of Naples and Sicily, born 1747, died 1777, eldest son of Charles III, excluded from succession due to disability. And then, nothing. No poem, no sermon, no statue. He was not remembered. He was redacted. The marble stayed smooth. The portrait frame remained empty. The pedestal was never built, because to carve it would be to admit he had once stood there, and to admit that would be to confront what the crown could not bear. That a kingdom that called itself Catholic, sacred, and ordained had once denied its own son the right to be seen. He was born with a crown waiting on his cradle, but the head beneath it never straightened, the mouth never closed, the words never formed. And so, the crown was taken away before he ever touched it. Felipe's tragedy wasn't only in his body. It was in the silence that followed it. The decisions made around him, above him, about him, never with him. The conversations behind drapes. The documents never written. The rituals skipped. The portraits avoided. The memory erased not by time, but by intention. They didn't punish him. They didn't beat him. They didn't exile him. They didn't kill him. They simply removed the world from his reach, and then, with time, removed him from the world. It is easier that way, for palaces, for thrones, for dynasties. Because when the system is designed for glory, there is no room for someone who reminds it of frailty, of unpredictability, of failure not earned, but inherited. He was not the only one. History is scattered with princes born too soon, daughters locked away, siblings labeled unfit, voices drowned in velvet and stone. But few are buried as completely as Felipe. Not in dirt, but in silence. He became a blank page bound into the middle of a gilded book. A ghost written out before he could ever become a shadow. And perhaps the deepest cruelty lies not in his condition, not in his seizures, not even in the restraints tied to his wrists. It lies in the fact that when he died, the world did not call it a loss. Because to lose something, one must first be willing to say it existed. We call him now a historical footnote, but he was never given a chapter. We wonder what he felt, but no one ever asked. We say he was mad, but what does madness mean to someone who was never granted the dignity of thought? We look at old ledgers, scrawled margins, vague letters, and we try to piece together a face that the court refused to capture. And we end with nothing. Just an open mouth, an erased name, a pedestal that remains forever empty. But perhaps the greater question, the one that lingers long after the candles go out and the music ends, is not what Felipe was. It is this. What does it say about us? That when power meets weakness, it so often chooses silence over compassion?